Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Everyday is Saturday. I'm Matt Stahl. I'm with my partner, Brad Gatto. And for our episode today, we are going to resume our breakdown of The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. So a book we've been following, and we're up to chapter 13 at this point.
Dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun.
We're going through this book at about the same speed that most people probably just read books. So,
You don't have to read the book.
We're over a year in, and we're, 13 out of 20 chapters through after today. So
For such an interesting book, it is a slower pace.
yes, it is a very interesting book. The name of the chapter is Room for Error, subtitle being the most important part of every plan is planning on your plan not going according to plan.
I love that.
Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled
nice.
peppers.
Before we jump into that, what is new in your world?
I don't know if there's anything necessarily new in my world. It's coming to the end of basketball season at our house. Baseball tryouts are right around the corner, and that's always exciting because it just means spring is coming. And in Minnesota, if you're listening to this and you live in Minnesota, I just keep waiting for the shoe to drop, so to speak. Like, when is winter going to happen?
We might be in the clear.
I don't know.
We might be close.
I don't believe it.
I don't believe it.
I don't think it's going to happen. I think we're going to get absolutely blasted in March or something.
Possibly, but it'll melt.
He's knocking on wood. Not supposed to knock on the table during a podcast, but
that wasn't wood.
I'm doing it.
He's knocking on something.
That's what we've got going on, is just transitioning of sports in the Gatto household. How about you?
Transition of sports from playing futsal, which looks like indoor soccer, to outdoor soccer. So we are
huge change.
It is a different sport altogether. If you watched it, you would say they're playing indoor soccer, but it is a different sport. Yeah, I mean, it looks like it. It's on a basketball court. It's a heavier ball, different strategy,
Well,
different footwork.
I'm just going to take your word for it.
I think that's a wise idea.
All right, let's jump into chapter 13 of Psychology of Money. Again, book by Morgan Housel. I think this book came out in 2020. I think that's right. He actually just released another book.
Yeah.
Did you know this?
I did know this. I
gotta read it.
I listened to it. I've not read it. I've listened to a talk about it, but it is 2020.
So, room for error. Plan not going according to plan. So he starts off with a story that I just want to kind of talk about in concept, and that is Las Vegas gambling, which, most people don't equate to, or, it seems like the opposite of what, when they think of like a financial advisor and then they think of like Las Vegas, they think, okay, those are very, very different. So interesting that we start off with that example, but he's talking about blackjack and how, as we all probably have at least heard, and maybe you've seen, they've done movies on this, multiple movies on this, card counting. Because it is entirely possible, Matt, to quote unquote count cards while playing blackjack, and then based on where the count is at, high or low, know if you should be betting big or not betting big based on the odds that are going to be in your favor. Now, in your favor, it might be 51-49, right? Which means there's still a 49% chance of failure. And these guys playing blackjack know this. And he says in here, it might sound strange given their profession, but their strategy relies entirely on humility. Humility that they don't know and cannot know exactly what's going to happen next. So they play their hand accordingly. So the whole point of this is you got to have enough money to stick around, right?
Right.
And so, yes, because you're still going to fail 49% of the time, even if everybody at the table is counting cards and playing by the book, so to speak, you're still going to fail 49% of the time. So you have to have enough bets. I think they say, like, let's just say you're going to do a $10 bet or something like that. I think you have to have like 100 bets.
Okay.
To be able to kind of like make it through and stave off, a bad run. Because even if, it's entirely possible to use 8, 10, 12 hands in a row. Yeah, in fact, he says that in your rule of thumb is that you should have at least 100 basic units or betting units to be able to stick around. And you can't get emotional about it. In other words, you can't, if the count is in your favor, get that wild hair where you're like, okay, I'm going in bigger than I would normally go in and get greedy in this moment. And so when things are going really well and quote unquote, the count is in your favor, you can't get super greedy. You just got to stick to the super boring, count the cards, play the cards, and then you have to have enough money to kind of stick around. So he starts with that.
That sounds a little more familiar to a topic, in our world. Legend has it that my father-in-law was a card counter.
Really?
Yeah, he had the skill.
Who started this legend? Him?
Who knows? But apparently it worked. So, yeah.
Did?
It did work, yeah.
Not only did he count cards, but supposedly he was good at it?
He supposedly was good at it. But you think about it, if there's any place that, studies human nature and digs into all this stuff, it's going to be the casinos. Look at those places. That's their whole, the whole success and infrastructure is based on knowing this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. For sure. Well, that being said, and this is a quote from the book, it says, history is littered with good ideas taken too far, which are indistinguishable from bad ideas. And then later in that paragraph, he says the only way to deal with them is by increasing the gap between what you think will happen and what can happen, while still leaving you the capability, making you capable of fighting another day. In other words, you got to stay in the game.
Mm-hmm.
In order to win long term, you have to stay in the game. So with that being said, sticking to the plan, being around for the part of the game is what he calls margin of safety. And that's kind of the first main point here is how do you build in a margin of safety? Now, the example he gives is of Benjamin Graham. We've mentioned Benjamin Graham on our podcast multiple times in the past. Mm-hmm. But if you are unfamiliar, he's kind of the godfather of value investing. Warren Buffett credits him with most of his knowledge. And we're all familiar with Warren Buffett. So Benjamin Graham's known for this concept that I just mentioned, which is margin of safety. In fact, he is quoted as saying, the purpose of margin of safety is to render the forecast unnecessary. Mm-hmm. What I think of, because he uses the word forecast, so immediately my brain goes to the weather. If you have every possible type of clothing for anything that could happen in the weather, then you don't really need to know what the weather is.
Right. Yeah.
So how do we do that? Like, what, that's the question from a financial planning perspective. What does this teach us? If we need to build in margin of safety in a practical matter, what should we be doing? How should we be thinking? And how do we be prepared for any forecast coming up?
Yeah.
And I'll start. I'll just say one of the things that immediately comes to mind is cash.
Yep.
Now, it's interesting, Matt, because right now, as we record this, cash for the first time in years is yielding a return. And
of any sort.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of people that were like, I don't want to be in cash. I want as little in cash as possible because I don't want to miss out on opportunity. A little less of that now because people can earn, 4 or 5% or something like that in cash. But that being said, I feel like this is a tug of war in our industry and just in financial planning in general is I don't want to miss out on opportunities. And so I don't want to leave a big margin for safety.
Mm-hmm. The funny part about that is having cash on hand actually puts you in a spot where you are ready for the opportunity as well. Right? Yep. So there's this double-edged sword when you look at it that way.
Well, if you have no cash, you could make the argument, or you don't have no margin of safety. You like the gamblers, like the guys playing blackjack, you could end up in a situation where I'm not in the game anymore. I had 100 bets in front of me. I didn't play it right. And so I lost all 100 bets. And so it could entirely be possible that the count is just swinging back in your favor right when you run out of money. And part of the importance of this is sticking to the plan. The other part is you have to be in the game when the opportunities reside.
Right.
Or reside? That's not the right word.
Present themselves up here.
You were going to let me get away with that too. You made that point. He does give a couple of examples of that in the book where he talks about Lehman Brothers or other companies banks that weren't around to take advantage of 2010 and 2011. All of a sudden the rates were way better and housing prices had plummeted, but you have to be able to be in the game.
Yeah. There's a great Warren Buffett quote. I'm going to put you in the spot and see if you remember it. I think we learned this probably at least 15 years ago. We both got a real kick out of it. Wow. Something about being in the ocean.
With your pants?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly how the quote goes, but I know generally speaking.
And I may totally butcher this. Something along the lines of no one knows who's wearing a swimsuit until the
tide goes out.
The tide goes out.
Yes.
Yes.
So margin of safety. How, other than cash, how else can you build in margin of safety? Any ideas?
So
I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah. One thing that came to mind immediately for me, and not to profile certain types of people, but I'm going to right now. So once upon a great time, I was an engineer, and I'm sure you've experienced it. Engineers typically want to understand things a little bit deeper than perhaps other people do.
Sure.
They want to see how things work. And an example that comes to mind for me is if you were to pull up some sort of plan that is projecting things out, they want to dig into that further and further until you get to the point that you realize, look, this is not exactly how it's going to play out, right? That's the only thing you can tell. That's the only thing I can really tell you is I know it's not going to actually work out this way.
Yeah.
So when you get so attached to a plan or you could call that a forecast.
Yep.
And anyone thing can send that in any different direction. That's problematic. So if you're dependent upon everything working out as the forecast is laid out, that could present a problem in a big way.
Yeah, it's funny how the more detailed you get and the more you try to plan for every outcome or get super specific, like it can hurt you more than it can help you because you get so focused in on, okay, now that we've built the spreadsheet, I feel really good about this. Like this is the direction that we're going to head.
Yep. And
the odds that you get to that exact spot, we all know this, right? Life isn't lived on a spreadsheet. Plan A hardly ever happens, all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
But the problem is in our industry, Matt, is that doesn't sell.
Right. Yeah.
If you think about some of the most well-known names to the average American, people on TV that have followings, shows, books, financial universities. I'm not going to name names specifically, but like in order to do that, you have to have a strong opinion. Nobody's going to follow you or care if your advice to them all the time is, well, it depends.
Yeah.
And you should probably have all kinds of like hedges and like, margins of safety built into your plan. That just doesn't sell. It has to be like, well, this is always the right way to do things, or this is always the wrong way to do things. In the book, Morgan brings this up. He says stock analysts give their clients price targets, not price ranges. Economic forecasters predict things with precise figures, rarely broad probabilities. The pundit who speaks in unshakable certainties will gain a larger following than the one who says, well, we can't know for sure, and speaks in probabilities. So just bringing that point home, the problem is we all want certainty to the point where if we view anybody as an expert or an authority in that area and they're willing to give that opinion and say, this is what you should do, we would rather have that than the person who is an authority stand up front and go, well, it depends.
We don't know.
And you should probably build in some sort of margin of safety, whether that's a cash position. That can be in insurances. Anytime you buy like insurance, car insurance, house homeowners insurance, life insurance, that's margin of safety. Like you're building in some sort of margin for potentially bad things or plan B to happen. Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying another thing that comes to mind is diversification in general. So
yeah,
it is if something seems like an opportunity, and it's that balance of fear and greed, right? So if something seems like such a great opportunity and you want to go all in on that, that is an example of letting greed get the best of you, and then you're riding that whether it's going up or it's going down.
Yeah. He gives the example in here of a Harvard psychologist did a study about home renovations. And anytime it was like, let's say it was me talking about your home renovation. So it wasn't mine, but I'm talking about yours. I would always be the guy that's like, yeah. Well, I know that they quoted you $100,000 for your renovation, but it's going to be at least 25 to 50% over budget. Like we always know when we're talking about somebody else. Yet in that same study, all the people that were talking about their own home renovations always thought it was going to come in on time and at budget. Mm-hmm. Like we're not willing to admit or build in that margin of safety on a personal level, which I thought was, psychologically speaking, that's just super interesting. A different way he says it in here is room for error. So these are very, very similar, right? Building in a margin of safety or building in some sort of room for error. And he's got a couple of examples that are great, but I think I'm just going to go back to the guy that we've already mentioned here a couple of times, and that's Warren Buffett. Mm-hmm. When you look at, and we talked about this before too, because he talks about this in previous chapters of the book, most companies that have been publicly traded have failed. Like when you look at the stock market today, It looks nothing like the stock market from 50 years ago.
Right.
And the companies that are being traded today are primarily not the companies from 50 years ago, which means most of them failed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Berkshire Hathaway, as we record this, I think is just approaching its $1 trillion market cap, the size. Now, been around for a very long time. Warren Buffett is obviously an older gentleman. I think he's 96. Warren's quote that Morgan puts in this book is, Warren Buffett expressed a similar idea when he told Berkshire Hathaway shareholders back in 2008, quote, I've pledged to you, the rating agencies and myself to always run Berkshire with more than ample cash. When forced to choose, I will not trade even a night's sleep for a chance at extra profits. So, long story short, Warren Buffett is building in room for error to the point where he has like a year's cash on hand. When Bill Gates started Microsoft, they said that he had 1 year's worth of payroll in cash because you just never know.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were building out for things that not necessarily based on history of like, well, if history, tells us anything, you should be just fine. Like we run all the modeling of what happened yesterday, and based on everything that we know and what happened yesterday, you should be just fine. And people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Morgan Housel in this book would tell you can't do that because it's entirely possible that something that has never happened yesterday is going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so you have to build in that room for error.
If we've learned one thing from this book, then that would certainly be it.
Well, and the other side of this too is, mentally. So if you get off the spreadsheets and building in rooms for error and things like that, we underestimate what our plan not going according to plan does to us.
Mm-hmm.
And how even if that spreadsheet says that, hey, look, there's going to be ups and downs in your plan. Sometimes you're going to have to go to plan B. Sometimes you're going to lose 30% of your life savings. And we look at it, but we look at the end result and we're like, yep, I love the end result. So I'm willing to do that. But we don't think through, can we mentally handle the roller coaster to get there?
Right.
The problem is a lot of people jump off during different parts of that ride and don't get to the end result.
Yeah. I think a lot of that is very subjective as well, in that we've talked about this before, of positioning this in a way for clients or anyone to think about kind of the Monday morning rule. You wake up, how much of in the example of someone who's retired, how much of your retirement income do you want to be subject to what's going on in the world?
Yeah.
And how uncomfortable does that make you feel?
Yeah.
And for some people, that's really high. For others, it's not very high at all. And I think that's just a self-awareness piece of being able to sleep at night. And in the end, that's likely one of the most important things for them is having the confidence and being able to put their head on the pillow without worrying day in and day out.
Yeah, for sure. Practically speaking, one of the ways that, we've talked about cash positions a little bit. I brought up the word insurance in here as a room for error, margin of safety play. The other thing you could do is just build in lower expectations. Now, there's definitely times in life where you don't want to have low expectations, right? It's good to have high expectations of yourself and certain outcomes that you're chasing. But the world at large, when it comes to financial planning, whatever goal, plan it is that you have, building in room for error, margin of safety, just really lowering expectations of how things are going to go. Mm-hmm. Morgan says in the book that he personally lops a third of traditional returns off of his expectation with the idea that if it turns out that I get average returns, then I'm just going to be happy, but I'm not going to expect it.
Right.
And so at Fiat, one of the things we've done consistently, like when it comes to retirement planning, and actually we get a pushback on this from quite a few people, is, let's see if you remember, what is the rate of return I like to use when spreadsheeting out long-term cash flow planning for retirement? My baseline.
5.5.
4. Why that's so funny?
That was way off.
Samsonite. I use 4. And the reason I use 4 is this concept right here, margin of safety, room for error. Because there's a lot of things. When you think about retirement planning, it could be this market cycling, the timing of when you retire, because then you get stuck outside of an average. It could be that we don't hit averages. It could be that you spend more money than you told me you were going to spend. It could be inflation doesn't work out the way that we anticipated it. It could be that your healthcare looks a lot different than we anticipated. There's a lot of things. And so we try to play conservative. And so conservative assumptions, room for error, margin of safety looks like don't expect market-based returns. If your plan works out with something less than that, that's good. Expect to live longer than you think you're going to, because that's the safe way to play that. Expect you're going to spend a little more money than you anticipated, or that your health isn't going to work out as well as you anticipated. And if you've got some wiggle in all of these areas, it's all about staying in the game and staving off those extended periods of loss to the casino.
I'm laughing because I'm definitely going to speak for myself, and I think I can speak for you as well. This might be a good concept for me to apply to time in my life. Maybe I'm not going to pull you all the way into that camp, but how many times have I been in a situation where it's like, yeah, I can be there.
Yeah.
In time.
You build no margin of safety in for that kind of stuff. That's very self-reflective there, Matt.
It's a good lesson. I will change today.
Okay. Wow.
Okay.
You heard it here first, folks. I don't know when this is going to come out. Sometime in March, I think, but it is not March right now. We're going to future episode. We'll circle back on that. I'm going to make a note of that and see if that changed. The other kind of language he uses in here that I want to bring up before we kind of start to wrap this up is what he calls the optimism bias. And the example he gives here, it's pretty extreme. It's Russian roulette. Now, if you're unfamiliar, right? This is an old school, back when. See, I'm so bad with like guns. I don't even the revolver with like what is that?
Colt 45.
Oh, like with the spinning chamber where you can like see the bullets. There's probably a name for this that I'm
revolver.
I'm absolutely getting destroyed by gun people right now. They're listening to this. They're like, this guy has no idea what he's talking about.
I don't either. It's a revolver.
But you spin it.
Yeah.
You put one bullet in. There's a 6-shooter, an 8-shooter, whatever. Yeah. And so the odds are in your favor. And then you have to like put to your head and pull the trigger. The odds are in your favor. You're gonna live. But his point is, like, if you have this optimism bias or this irrational amount of optimism, it's true. But the downside of that,
it's not so great.
I would say it's unacceptable. The downside is not worth the upside. There's no margin of safety that can compensate for that amount of risk, is how Morgan puts it in the book. The danger of rational optimism most of the time masks the odds of ruin some of the time. In other words, you have to survive to succeed. Mm-hmm. And so you have to stay in the game like we talked about before. And there's a lot of things that we do this with, right? Where somebody says, if there's a 95% chance this is going to work out. And I use that figure because one, he uses in the book, but two, in our industry, Matt, that's the acceptable standard deviation. Mm-hmm. If you're unfamiliar, it's just the odds of things working out. The second standard deviation is the 95th percentile. And so that's saying 95% of the time, this is going to work out. And again, in most things that we do, that's the acceptable amount of risk. If you're going to be conservative, is only 5% of the time is this going to fail. Now, we've brought this up in the past too, but it's an oldie but a goodie. Mm-hmm. The example, he used Russian roulette. The example I use is the airplane. Mm-hmm. If you're going to get on an airplane and the pilot's standing there shaking everybody's hands as they walk on the plane, he goes, yeah, there's a 95% chance we're going to land. I'm not getting on the plane. Because like Russian roulette, there's not too many times where passenger jets go down and anybody makes it.
Right.
I always kind of laugh to myself a little bit when they're like, use your seat as a flotation device in case of a water landing. Like, has anybody ever done that other than when Sully landed that plane on the Hudson?
I'm sure at some point.
Well, yeah, it happened once and it made news and now they made a movie about it. That's how random or not normal that is. If they make a movie about it, it's not normal. Right? You have to survive to succeed. The ability to do what you want, when you want, for as long as you want has an infinite ROI, as he says earlier in the book. I want to wrap it up by telling this story because this is I'm a history buff in general. World War II specifically, I love. And he tells a story about the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, if you're unfamiliar, it was the largest battle in history at that point. The Battle of Stalingrad in World War II. And right before it started, the German tanks, if you're unfamiliar, they had far superior tanks to us in World War II. And they had 104 tanks that were ready at this point in time for this battle. And when the battle came, fewer than 20 of them were operable, worked. I mean, can you imagine, like, you're sitting there and you're ready, like, okay, we're gearing up for this, and less than 20% of your entire fleet, which was the primary, leverage point that they had over us in the war, was their tanks. And none of them work. Like, over 80 tanks just sitting there inoperable. Well, of course, they start digging into it. Like, what is going on? Because the tanks have been sitting there inactive behind enemy lines for weeks, right? Now they go to use them. Now they don't work. Well, what they found out was, the engineers found out, was mice. They'd been sitting there in the field waiting to be used. And of all the engineering and the feat of engineering that had been, put together at that point in time by the German engineers, what they did not plan for and could not foresee, because it had never happened before in the history of the world, is mice were going to get into these tanks and eat away at the wires, and they were going to become inoperable at one of the most inopportune times. Crazy how something like that can shape history.
No kidding.
So how do you plan for mice in your tanks, right? Or how do you build in margin of safety or room for error? I think a great example of an industry that's done it extremely well, and I used the example before, is the airline industry. You get in a modern jet today, a passenger jet, there's quadruple redundancy in the electrical systems. So it could fail 3 times and it's still going to work because it's got a 4th redundancy. They can land with one engine. You don't need all the engines. You just need one, or fly with one engine, and they can technically land without any engines. They're built to do that. Just like suspension bridges that we drive over. Another example he gives in the book, like, large percentages of the cables can fail before the bridge actually fails. They're building in all these redundancies and this margin for safety. Now, you and I in those areas are like, yes, please do that. There's nobody that's going to argue like, no, build the bridge right at capacity, or just put one electrical system in the jet and let's just see what happens. Now, we do this in our own personal lives all the time because we talk about one, opportunity cost. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to be that conservative, because if I'm that conservative, I'm going to miss out on upside, or I'm going to miss out on opportunities that I have down the line. We do it not only with our investments and rate of return, we do it with taxes. Right. Because we think if I defer all these tax bills, I get more opportunity with that money. We do this with our paychecks, in the fact that we don't save a significant portion in cash and have a really big cash reserve just in case we don't have that paycheck anymore. Right. There's just a lot of areas that we do it where it can get to a point where we can't stay in the game. So the most important part of every plan is to plan on your plan not going according to plan.
Love it.
Those are words to live by there, Matt. Very, very deep. Thank you for that. That being said, on a practical level, I feel like we do this pretty well at Fiat. In fact, if we get in trouble for anything when we're running plans for people, I hear it all the time. They're like, well, we're expecting more than 4%, aren't we? Well, yeah, I want it to be more than 4, but I want your plan to work at 4. Because if it works at 4, I've got all kinds of margin of safety built in, the way that we build income distribution, all of that kind of stuff. Because I never want to have to apologize to somebody who's in retirement that, you know what, our plan didn't go according to plan and I didn't plan on that happening.
Right.
And so we have to build in, we at least here at Fiat try to build in for margin of safety and room for error. But if you're out there listening and you don't work with Fiat and you want to see what that looks like, feel free to reach out to us, or in your own plan, find ways to do that. And probably beyond what you think is reasonable as far as that margin of safety or room for error. If you need an example to look to, Warren Buffett is the perfect example. The guy has sat on way more cash and been far more conservative than most people would ever be. Yet here we look, 80 years into his career, and he's averaged more than double the return of the markets and is worth more money than he could ever spend in his lifetime if he wanted to. So with that said, thanks for listening to this episode of Every Day is Saturday. I'm Brad Gatto here with my co-host Matt Stahl. If you need to reach out to us or want to reach out to us, you can find everything you need to find on our website, fiatwm.com, fiatwm.com. We'll see you all next Saturday.
Thank you for listening to Every Day is Saturday. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Fiat Wealth Management. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.